5 years ago, I set out on the most epic adventure of my life, riding a bike to the South Pole. This is my story. Previously on the South Pole Epic, I flew down to Punta Arenas, explored the Straits of Magellan, and my bike, which I had shipped a month earlier, finally arrived. I had my room at the hostel reserved until about the time I was supposed to fly to Antarctica. But the weather in Antarctica had been really bad this year, and so they hadn't been able to get in the scheduled flights, and they were behind schedule. And the camp that they run there was running low on fuel and supplies. And so the next flight to Antarctica would be one to resupply the camp, and then I would be able to fly on the flight after that. So I asked my hostel if I could extend my stay there. It was summer there, and so they were completely booked, and told me I would have to leave. So now I needed to find a new place to stay for an unknown amount of time as I waited for my flight. I got the address of the bishop for the ward that is in this area. I walked over to his house and knocked on the door. His wife answered the door to find some strange guy who doesn't speak Spanish. They don't speak English, but I was able to tell them that I am a Mormon, and they called the missionaries. The bishop offered to let me stay at his house while I wait for my flight. I know only some very basic Spanish, and they know almost no English, so communication is very hard. Video.
Oh, video.
She's changing them.
Right, yeah.
¿A dónde es mejor? No, Ender, si tenemos que repararlo.
So the dower broke the floor.
¿Te ayudo con Benjamín?
No.
Oh, Elder York?
The Dower's not here.
Oh, he's not here.
We left him in the house.
I walked down to the ALE office after church to let them know where I am. Mark wanted to drive out to the house so that they would know how to find me. When he got here, he said he thought bishops were rich with lots of rings and stuff. I told him that Mormon bishops were just members of the congregation and it was a volunteer, non-paid job.
Where do you want it? You want to be in the picture?
Yeah.
Acá.
Benjamin, Pablo,
Pablito. Little Pablo.
Marie,
Marcia.
Marcia, Pablo Senior, Grande, Pablo Grande. So every day I'd call into ALE to get an update on the flight status, and then with nothing else to do, I would walk around Punta Arenas, and I helped the bishop make an nativity.
¿Eso lo va a grabar el hermano? Mi amor, ¿me va a grabar el hermano? Voy a estar en YouTube después. ¿Ah? No haga eso.
Finally, the time came to fly to Antarctica. November 29th, 2013. Made it to Antarctica. The flight was a bit different. The jet is a Russian jet and is about what you would imagine a Russian military plane would be like on the inside. They had a dozen or so rows of seats with cargo behind. Because they are behind on flights, they packed the plane, which meant some people needed to sit on the military-style benches. I volunteered. I was sitting with a big blue Arctic truck in my lap. The landing was interesting. They had a camera on the front of the plane and a big screen TV that would show as we approached the runway. First views of Antarctica were just as expected. Landing on ice was fun. The plane touched down, the engine went into full reverse as usual, but of course there was no braking from the wheels, and the steering seemed strange. Anyway, it took a lot of runway to come to a stop. ALE had some customized vans which picked us up and drove us out to the base camp on Union Glacier. November 29th, 2013. I went for 2 bike rides today to test the bike. The first I kept it relatively easy, but I still got a bit wet from the sweat. The second one I only had an hour to do the circuit, so I pushed hard and arrived at dinner soaked. I hung around the dinner building for a while trying to dry out, but it wasn't working, so I came back to my tent, took off everything down to the base layer, and got in my sleeping bag, and instantly I'm toasty warm. There are no trees in Antarctica. Well, except maybe this tree that is used as a marker for safe travel on Union Glacier. Did you know that Antarctica is the 5th largest continent? Okay, there are only 7 continents, so yeah. But still, it is larger than Australia, and it is larger than Europe, and it is also larger than the United States. Asia has the highest mountain, Mount Everest. However, Antarctica has the highest average altitude of all the continents. In fact, the South Pole is at an elevation of about 9,300 feet, or about 2,800 meters. However, most of that is ice. The land at the South Pole is only about 300 feet above sea level, which means there is about 9,000 feet of ice. That is nearly 2 miles thick. In fact, on my way to the South Pole, I went over the top of a mountain range, and I didn't even see it because it was buried in ice. About 90% of the ice in the world is in Antarctica, and that ice contains about 70% of the fresh water on Earth. It is said that if all the ice in Antarctica melted, the oceans would rise by more than 200 feet, which means almost all of Florida would be underwater. But that isn't going to happen anytime soon. Nobody would be surprised to learn that Antarctica is the coldest continent. But just how cold is it? Well, the lowest temperature on record for Antarctica was a minus 135.8 degrees Fahrenheit, or 93.2 degrees below 0 Celsius. At the South Pole, the winter temperatures can drop below minus 109, which is the temperature of dry ice. So just think about that. It gets so cold at the South Pole that carbon dioxide can freeze. And the highest temperature in history at the South Pole was 9.9 degrees Fahrenheit, which is still 22 degrees below freezing. When I was at the South Pole, the temperatures were about minus 40. The interesting thing about 40 below is 40 below Fahrenheit is the same temperature as 40 below Celsius. Back in 2015, about 10 feet of snow fell in Boston. They made a big pile of snow from clearing off the roads. That pile of snow took until the middle of July to completely melt. I can't even imagine the amount of climate warming and time needed to melt the Antarctic ice cap. Did you know that Antarctica is the windiest continent? To a large extent, that is due to katabatic winds. As you know, cold air is heavier than warm air, and as we already discussed, it is extremely cold at the South Pole, and the South Pole is quite high in elevation. Katabatic winds are created when that cold air falls from the South Pole down to the coast. Those winds can reach 200 miles per hour, which is like a Cat 5 hurricane or an F4 tornado. And those winds are flowing from the South Pole to the coast. So if you are thinking of doing an expedition to the South Pole, you're going to be going uphill into a headwind in the snow. And you thought Grandma had it hard going to school. So, cold, windy, high elevation, and lots of ice. But did you know that Antarctica is technically a desert? In fact, it is the largest desert in the world. In the interior of Antarctica, annual precipitation can be less than 2 inches, and in the dry valleys, they haven't seen precipitation in over 2 million years. The humidity is also extremely low. The relative humidity at the South Pole is often as low as 0.03%. So, in spite of all the ice in Antarctica, it is still the driest continent on Earth. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle speculated about the existence of Antarctica. However, Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1820, and it was about 20 years after that before they knew it was a continent and not just some islands. The Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen led the first expedition that reached the South Pole. When Robert Falcon Scott arrived, he was disappointed to see that Amundsen had already planted a Norwegian flag at the South Pole. Now there's a research base at the South Pole named after Amundsen and Scott. In front of the building is a ring of flags from each of the countries that has signed the Antarctic Treaty. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in December 1959 and dedicates the continent to peaceful research activities. There are 48 nations that have signed the treaty. At the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station, there is only 1 day per year. The sun rises in September and sets in March. For 6 months it is day, and for 6 months it is night. During the summer months, when the sun is constantly above the horizon, more sunlight reaches the surface of the South Pole than over a similar period of time at the equator. Next time on the South Pole Epic, we look at the ground-penetrating radar to plan the route to the South Pole.
Second depot is going to be
I continue to test my bike riding on Union Glacier.
This never stopped and you're good, huh?
And finally, I fly out to Hercules Inlet to begin the expedition.